Hello everybody, I'm Miss Lisa, and welcome back to another episode of Woke Art for Kids. Today we're going to be doing an art project that's based on the book Reaching for the Moon by Katherine Johnson. So this is an autobiography, and she has written a book about her life. Now, normally we would use words when we write about our life, but I thought it would be interesting to write her autobiography, well, her biography, because we are not Katherine Johnson. I thought it would be interesting to write another version and to write it with numbers, because she was an amazing mathematician. She had an incredible love for math, and she was exceedingly good at math, and she did a lot of work for the NASA space projects. So I've got an example of a piece of artwork that's all about numbers. And this was done by an artist, an American artist named Jasper Johns. And he's done a lot of these paintings about numbers. And if you look at this closely, you can see it's just a bunch of numbers. But they're done in an unusual and interesting way, very simple, but yet it grabs your attention. So I thought it would be interesting to take that idea and to write her biography, translated from her autobiography, into numbers. And this is what I came up with. So let me talk you through it, and then you can either follow along with me and do another one. I've got another piece of paper here and I'll take you through it. Or you can start this project by making the little rectangles and then writing your own autobiography in numbers. So let me show you what I've done here. I have taken a 9 by 12 inch rectangle of white paper, and I've divided it into 64 equal rectangles. So the length of each rectangle is 1.5 inches, and the width is 1 1/8 inches. And that way we can get 8 by 8. And so I've done that with a ruler. I normally don't use a ruler when I do art, but for this project, I've used a ruler to divide my paper into 64 equal rectangles. And again, those rectangles measure 1 1/8 inch by 1.5 inch. So now we need some numbers to put in our rectangles. And the first number I'm going to put in there is 1918. That's the year that she was born. So I'm going to write 1 9 1 8 and then I'm going to come down here and you can see the number 35. And that number came from the 35th state in the Union, which is West Virginia. And that's where she was born. So we've got 1918, 35 for West Virginia, and 30. This was the house that she grew up in as a child. She was on 30 Church Street in the town of, Springs. White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. The next row, 13. She started high school at age just past almost 11. She was nearly 11, but she started at age 10. But she graduated from high school at age 13. So she graduated from high school, and the next four numbers are 1932 in 1932. And she graduated when she turned 18, an age that a lot of kids graduate from high school. She was already graduating from college. So at age 18, in 1937, she graduated from college. The next four numbers are 1, 9, 3, 9, and that was the year she married Jimmy Goebel. So Jimmy Goebel was her first husband, and she was one of the first students to integrate into West Virginia University, because she was African American. And this was still back in the time of segregation. So she was one of the first three students to integrate into West Virginia University. And that was for a graduate program in math. But then she decided that she would rather start a family. So she went back home to her husband, Jimmy Goebel, and they had 3 daughters. So there's the 3. Then in 1952, this was an important year for her. Well, they're all important years. But in this year, she started working at the Langley Flight Research Division, which would later become part of NASA. So 1952. And unfortunately, Jimmy dies in 1956 from cancer. So she's raising her 3 girls, and she's working at the Langley Flight Research Division. And suddenly, in 1957, the Russians launch Sputnik, which was a satellite. And this started the space war, the space race. So Americans wanted to be technologically advanced, and the Russians wanted to be technologically advanced. And so both Russia and the US were trying to put astronauts into space. And this was the first instance of anything going up and going into outer space. So the Sputnik satellite went up and around and came down. And that started NASA on its way in 1958. So all of a sudden, things are changed because it became clear that there was going to have to be a lot of collaboration and technical teaching and sharing of ideas within different groups in the US if any vast and rapid knowledge was going to be used to be able to get a man into space or an astronaut into space. At that point, they were pretty much all men. So Catherine's group was absorbed into NASA, and suddenly she was very, very busy. I mean, she was already. She was absorbed into the space team, the official space team. And then in 1959, she marries James Johnson. And I should tell you, I forgot to tell you what she actually did at Langley, because this is really important. At Langley, she joined the group of African American women called the computers. And this was before computers were machines. They were actually people. And they redid all the calculations to make sure that, well, let's start at the beginning. They did calculations for the engineers. So the male engineers would design things and then ask the human computers to work out the math to make sure that their ideas were viable and that whatever they were doing would work. Now, eventually, IBM made computers that were machines, but even at that point, the early days, the computers would make mistakes. The machine computers would make mistakes. So Katherine would check the data that the machine computers would generate, and sometimes she found mistakes. And so she was a very, very good computer. She did all of her calculations manually. She used math that she had learned, and she could figure all of these trajectories out. Trajectories would be how things move, how you could send them out into space, and how they would come back. So that was her job, and she was working very hard in this department, which never really, they borrowed her one day because she was able to do these calculations, and they never really gave her back. So she stayed with this group of male engineers, and she became involved in very, very important work. One of them started in, well, one thing that happened to her, because she was so good at this, was in 1961. Let's put 1961. NASA was trying to send an astronaut into space, and astronaut Alan Shepard was chosen for the job, and he was ready to go. But he wanted to make sure that the calculations were correct. And so he called on Katherine to recheck all of the calculations that the computers, machine computers, had done to make sure that he would get into space and back again. And so she will put 1961. We'll put 1 here because she was highly involved in getting the first American into space, the first American. And Alan Shepard flew on Freedom 7. The spacecraft was named Freedom 7, so we'll put a 7 there. Now the following year, another astronaut, John Glenn, let's put 1962. There was lots of things going on in space at this time. 1962. He was going to become the first American to orbit the Earth. So let's put a 1 there because he was the first American to orbit the Earth. She also worked on the Apollo projects. She worked on Apollo 8, Apollo 11. Now, Apollo 11 was very important because this was the lunar landing. So she was involved in making sure, she did all the calculations to make sure that the lunar module would be able to reunite with the command module and get the astronauts home. She was saying that most people were worried about getting astronauts to the moon, but she was really worried about getting them home again. She wanted to make sure everybody got home safely and their families were reunited, and that was a lot of responsibility. But she did it just fine. She got everybody home and she did all of her calculations properly. She never made mistakes. I'm also going to put a 1 here because since the astronauts landed on the moon, Neil Armstrong was able to step onto the moon. He took that first step on the moon, which he called 1 small step for man and 1 giant step for mankind. Now in 2015, let's go ahead and put 1-5 for 2015. She was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by then President Barack Obama. So in 2015, she was awarded the Presidential Medal of Honor, and she was 97. She was 97 when she accepted that. That was some honor for all of her work, for her indispensable work at NASA. And she passed away only last year at age 101. So there we filled our biography with numbers. Each number has great significance for her life. And you'll notice perhaps that these numbers up here are black and white, and then the second half is in color. And I wanted to some way distinguish the beginning and middle of her life from the middle and end of her life, because she was still living in a very segregated society. She was not allowed to go to the same schools as the white children, and her family, it was very much segregated at the time when she lived in Sulphur Springs. So they would have to go into the store through a different door. They couldn't sit in the theater in the same area. They had to have different drinking fountains. And even at Langley, when she started at Langley, they would all come together to work during the day, And then in the evening, they would go their separate ways because the African American women did not live in the same part of town as the white families. So segregation was still a thing until 1958, and even at this point, there was resistance. But here, things were starting to change because there was a federally mandated law that said no more segregation. We are going to desegregate now. So what else can I tell you about this biography? I wanted to read you a couple of quotes from Katherine Johnson. The first one is, it's a teaching from her father. She said, "My father's teaching had been instilled inside me. He told her, 'You are no better than anyone else, but nobody else is better than you.'" So he told her this when she was just amazing with numbers. She was no better than anybody else, but nobody else is better than her for other reasons, right? And she kept this with her all the time. It comes back during the story in different parts of the story. She tells her own daughters the same thing. And she remembers this when she's working with the male engineers, because now she's an African American woman in a group of male engineers at NASA. And they expect her to do the calculations for them, but they're not giving her the whole story. So she's trying to push back a little bit because she needs the story to be able to completely understand what she's doing. And so she said, she started asking questions. And that was where her voice really started coming out. When she was given things to do, she asked, why? Why am I doing this? What do you want to find out? And they were put off at the beginning because why would an African American female ask the male engineers why? They want her to do something, you just do it. But she wanted to know why. And so they were not sure about that. But eventually they gave her more of the backstory, what they needed her to work out and why. And then the next thing she started asking was, why not? And so this again caused a little bit of a stir because they're not used to having to answer these questions. But then she started asking, what happens next? So when everybody sat down and realized that if they gave her a lot more information, she would be able to provide a much better answer, a more thorough answer, and everybody benefits from that. So she says, my questions helped me understand better, and they also helped the engineers understand better. So she definitely had a voice, and she was an amazing person. She spent lots and lots of time tutoring. She helped kids when she was 4 years old. She helped her siblings. She helped kids at school. I mean, they were all older than her, but she still helped them anyway. She said after they got used to the fact that she was younger, it was okay, and they would just learn happily from Katherine. So that's why the first part of this artwork here is going to be in black and white. I'm trying to show you that up until, well, basically, when Sputnik went up, everything was still segregated, but things started changing in 1958 when everybody realized they were going to have to come together and learn together to make a man on the moon become a reality. So let's just go ahead and start with the black. I'm going to draw these numbers a bit darker. And in case you're wondering, I have drawn some guidelines on my paper as well. I don't normally draw lines on my paper, but because this is math, I felt like I wanted it to look a little bit tidy. And aligned. So I have drawn a few lines on my paper very lightly to help me keep the numbers in nice rows. And I'm just going to go over these now with my black crayon. So again, she was born in the 35th state in the Union, which was West Virginia. And this is the address. Her house was 30 Church Street, White Sulphur Springs, West Virginia. Now we have 13 because she was 13 when she graduated from high school. In 1932. And she was 18 when she graduated from college in 1937. She married Jimmy Goebel in 1939. And she was one of the first African American students to integrate into West Virginia University. But she decided to come home, and she had her 3 daughters. And she began working at Langley Flight Research Division in 1952. She was one of the computers in skirts. She did amazing calculations. Sadly, her husband, Jimmy, passes away in 1956. And then in 1957, the Russians launched Sputnik. There were actually a couple Sputniks. But this is when Americans started realizing they were going to have to get going. They were falling behind in technology. So NASA was formed, and it was desegregated. It was formed in 1958. And then she marries her second husband, James Johnson, in 1959. We'll put 59. In 1961, She checks all of Alan Shepard's all of the calculations that are being used to send Alan Shepard into space. He's the first American in space, and he traveled on Freedom 7. So here's the 7. Another astronaut, John Glenn, in 19... 62. Became the first astronaut to orbit Earth, and she was involved in those calculations as well. And she worked on the Apollo 8 mission. I believe the astronauts orbited the moon 10 times with Apollo 8, and then they landed on the moon with Apollo 11. So let's put the 11 in there, because she was very much involved in the Apollo 11 lunar landing and being able to get the lunar the astronauts back to the command capsule and get everybody home safely. So there's the one small step for man, one giant step for mankind. That's the one there. And then we have 15 for 2015, because in 2015, Katherine, at age 97, was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and she lived until she was 101 years old. Quite a life. This is a very good book. It's exceedingly interesting, and I think it helps us understand the history of segregation and desegregation a little bit better, because she lived it. She lived that life, and she tells it in a story, how it affects herself, her family, and how they got through it together. So I would highly recommend reading this book, and I hope you had I hope this was interesting to think of doing a biography in a different way without words. If you want, you can add more color to this, and I would suggest you try to do your own. It's a very interesting way to try to take something that you would normally write in words and think, how could you translate it into numbers? And how would you set it up to make some story of your life? Some things are a little bit trickier, like how do we write West Virginia as a number? So I went instead to the number of West Virginia as it was incorporated into the United States. So you can sort of think about how you can get to the numbers, and that's an interesting exercise in itself. And then come up with one of these amazing arrays of numbers that describes your life or the life of somebody else. So I hope that was interesting, and take care. Until next time, goodbye.